On the evening of June 10th, 1986, Sue Snow climbed into her backyard hot tub in a small suburb outside of Seattle, Washington. The water felt amazing, so Sue told her two daughters to come join her. The girls came over and jumped in the hot tub with their mom, and immediately they began laughing and splashing each other. And right away, it reminded Sue of when her daughters were actually really young. In reality, her daughters were not little kids anymore. Her oldest was home from college for summer, and her youngest was already 15 and would head up to college herself in a couple of years. So as a result, Sue cherished moments like this, when life just sort of felt simple again. And tonight actually felt even more special than normal because Sue had actually been so busy at work lately that she'd barely gotten to see her girls at all. Sue was a vice president at a bank, and she had just landed a $5 million account that afternoon. This was a huge accomplishment, but it had taken a toll, with lots of late nights and very stressful meetings. Just then, Sue's husband, Paul Webking, came outside with some soda and champagne, and Sue looked up at him with surprise. Paul grinned, handed the soda to the girls, and poured Sue a glass of champagne. Then he raised his own glass to make a toast. He said he knew Sue didn't like to talk about her accomplishments, but he was so proud of her, and she deserved to be celebrated for closing such a huge deal at work. The girls cheered, and Paul leaned in to give Sue a kiss. Sue smiled, and she knew that if right now somebody took a picture of this moment, she and Paul would look like the perfect couple. But the truth was, their relationship had been strained for quite a while. 9 months ago, Paul had made a terrible confession. He'd cheated on Sue with an old girlfriend. He swore it only happened once and that it didn't mean anything, but Sue had been absolutely crushed. At the time this happened, she and Paul had been together for 8 years. They were talking about getting married, and Paul looked after Sue's daughters like they were his own, and so Sue wasn't ready to throw all of that away. So they'd started couples counseling, and just 2 months after Paul's confession, they had an impromptu wedding. Sue hoped this marriage would actually fix their relationship. But truthfully, Sue had never been able to shake the fear that Paul's cheating had not stopped. Paul was a long-haul trucker, which meant he spent days and days at a time on the road. And ever since he confessed to cheating on her, Sue spent the entire time he was gone wondering who he was with. The sound of her daughter's laughter stopped Sue from spiraling further into these intrusive thoughts about her husband, and her attention snapped back to her family. They spent the evening talking and laughing together, and Sue reminded herself to focus on all the positive things she had in her life. And by the time she climbed out of that hot tub that night, she actually was in a good mood again. But the next morning, Sue woke up with a pounding headache. Unfortunately, the stress from work and her constant concerns about Paul had made these morning headaches all too common. Paul had already left for work, and her oldest daughter had spent the night out with her boyfriend. So Sue rolled out of bed and walked down the hall to say good morning to her youngest daughter, Haley, and then after that, she went right to the medicine cabinet in her bathroom. She grabbed a bottle of extra-strength Excedrin and washed down 2 pills with water from the sink, hoping this would get rid of her headache. A little later that morning, Haley stepped out of the shower in the other bathroom. She wrapped her towel around herself and then opened the door to go back to her bedroom. But she heard something strange. The water in her mom's bathroom sink was running, and she thought she heard water splashing onto the floor. Haley called out for her mother, but she didn't get an answer. So Haley walked down the hallway, and as she did, the sound of running water got louder, but she couldn't hear her mom moving around or anything. Haley approached her mother's bathroom door, which was slightly open, and through the crack, she saw that the tap water was on and the sink was overflowing with water. Haley rushed in to turn off the water, but then she saw something on the ground and she just screamed. Her mother was crumpled on the floor in her bathrobe with her back up against the bathtub. Sue's eyes were wide open and her fingers were curled up like she was trying to grip something that wasn't there. And so after a second of screaming, Haley stopped and bent down and checked her mother's pulse because she couldn't tell if she was even alive. And she found her mother's pulse was there, but it was faint. In a total panic now, Haley turned off the water and then ran to the phone in her mother's room, but she wasn't really thinking clearly, so instead of immediately calling 911, she called her mother's friend. When the friend heard what was going on, she told Haley to call 911 right now, and the friend said she'd be over in a second. A few minutes later, the friend and the paramedics arrived, and Haley, who was totally upset, led them all to the bathroom where her mother was. The paramedics quickly examined Sue and began pulling off her robe to check for hidden injuries, and as they did, one of them asked Haley if her mother had a history of drug use. And Haley shook her head and said no, she sometimes took over-the-counter drugs, but that was it. Meanwhile, Sue, despite having a light pulse, was still completely unresponsive. and so the paramedics put a tube down her throat, they lifted her onto a stretcher, and then ran with her back through the house out the front door, with Haley and her mom's friend following behind. The paramedics loaded Sue into the back of the ambulance and told Haley that her mom would need to be airlifted from the local hospital to a bigger hospital in Seattle, and Haley would need to find her own way there. Then they shut the ambulance doors and sped off with the sirens blaring. Haley stood in her front yard in a total daze. Her mother's friend put her hand on Haley's arm and told her she would drive her to the hospital, and she also asked Haley if there was anyone else she could call. And that was the first time since Haley found her mother on the bathroom floor that she thought of her mom's husband, Paul. Paul was loading his 16-wheeler truck in the back of a big industrial warehouse when one of his coworkers came over to him looking panicked. The coworker said Sue's friend had just called dispatch and told them that Sue had been rushed to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. Paul immediately put the box he was holding down and asked his coworker, what else do you know? What else did Sue's friend say? But the coworker just shrugged. Sue's friend hadn't given any more details than that. So Paul gave up on loading his truck and just ran out to his own car and began driving towards the city. But as he drove, he was more confused than worried about Sue. He knew that lately she'd been having a lot of anxiety, and since Sue's friend had not mentioned a car accident or any kind of big injury, Paul kind of assumed that Sue might just be having a big panic attack. But 15 minutes later, Paul walked through the doors of the emergency room and he saw Haley's pale face, and he knew that whatever happened to her mother was not just a panic attack. Paul asked Haley what was happening, and she blurted out, "Mom's brain dead," and then she began crying. Paul stared at Haley in shock. This didn't make any sense. When he left that morning, Sue was in bed sleeping peacefully, totally fine. But Haley obviously knew more than he did, and she was hysterical, and so with a sinking feeling, Paul realized something horrible was really happening. This was real. And so as his heart rate sped up, he tried to catch his breath, and then he just pulled Haley in tight for a hug. A few minutes later, Paul tracked down the doctor outside of Sue's room in the intensive care unit, but the doctor didn't have much more information than Haley did. He said that unfortunately, Sue's brain had been starved of oxygen for so long that she would never wake up again. But he said the medical staff could not figure out why. Essentially, Sue was a healthy 40-year-old woman, except for the fact that she was now suddenly brain dead. Then, in a soft, comforting voice, the doctor said now there was only one thing left to do. Paul was going to have to decide when to take Sue off of life support and let her die. Paul just stood there staring at the doctor like he couldn't even process what he was just being told. And then finally, he just asked the doctor if he could please go see his wife. The doctor nodded, and as Paul walked into Sue's room and saw her laying there connected to all these tubes and wires, he wondered how in the world he was going to find the strength to make this terrible choice. One day later, the medical examiner put on a pair of rubber gloves and walked up to the metal table that held Sue's body. Paul had waited until Sue's older daughter could make it to the hospital to say her goodbye to her mother before Paul gave the doctors permission to take Sue off of life support. And so now, the medical examiner had to solve the mystery of why this seemingly healthy woman had suddenly collapsed and died just 5 hours later. An assistant took notes as the medical examiner narrated her findings, but she was as baffled as the hospital staff. Sue had not had a stroke, aneurysm, or a heart attack. She had no broken bones, no skull fractures, and no internal bleeding. And a drug panel showed she had not overdosed on any of the more common street drugs like heroin or cocaine. So the medical examiner began to think that her only hope of solving this mystery would likely come from the full toxicology report, which would take several more days to complete. But then suddenly, the medical examiner's assistant stopped taking notes and interrupted the medical examiner mid-sentence. The assistant asked if the medical examiner smelled something strange. The medical examiner shook her head and looked at her assistant confused. The assistant wrinkled up her nose and took in a big inhale, and then nodded with certainty like, "Yup, I smell something." So the medical examiner did the same thing and breathed in deep through her nose, and immediately her eyes went wide. The odor was faint, but it was very clear. Sue's body definitely smelled like almonds. In all her years of performing autopsies, this medical examiner had never seen this before. And so even though she now had a theory as to what happened to Sue, she was already kind of questioning whether that could possibly be true. I mean, this only ever happened in movies or detective novels. But she still made a special note to check for one more chemical on Sue's toxicology report, because cyanide has a telltale smell: almonds. 5 days after the medical examiner sent Sue's blood off to be tested, Detective Mike Dunbar from the local police department was about to pop some bread in the toaster for breakfast when his phone rang. Dunbar answered, and his sergeant quickly told him to cancel whatever plans he had that day because he was catching a new case. A woman named Sue Snow had been murdered, and before Dunbar could say anything, his sergeant said her toxicology report showed that Sue had been poisoned with cyanide. Dunbar was so shocked he had to ask the sergeant to repeat himself to make sure he heard correctly. Any murder in the quiet Seattle suburb where Sue lived was totally unusual, but cyanide poisoning sounded like something out of a movie. But the sergeant said, yep, there's no doubt about it, it was cyanide. He said the medical examiner and her assistant had smelled almonds during Sue's autopsy, which is a sign that perhaps this was cyanide, and then sure enough, when they sent off her blood, it came back positive for cyanide. Sue had a lethal dose in her system. The sergeant reminded Dunbar that cyanide was a fast-acting poison, and there wouldn't have been more than a few minutes between when Sue ingested it and when she collapsed. That meant that Sue must have come into contact with whatever poisoned her inside of her house, because she collapsed in her bathroom. So the sergeant gave Dunbar the family's phone number, and then the two hung up, and then Dunbar immediately called the family's house. After a few rings, Paul picked up with a very distracted-sounding hello. Dunbar introduced himself, but Paul barely seemed able to hear him. And then eventually, Paul actually just cut Dunbar off and apologized and said, I can't talk right now because I'm about to leave for Sue's burial. But Dunbar told Paul that unfortunately, the news he had could not wait. He told Paul Sue had been poisoned, and Dunbar needed to come to their home as soon as possible to look for whatever had killed her because it could still be in that house, which means the family could still be at risk. Paul was completely silent for a minute, and then he told the detective that, that's shocking, but still he would need to talk to him later on because of this burial. So Dunbar kind of resigned to the fact that Paul was not going to budge on this, told Paul to please gather Sue's family at his house after the burial, and Dunbar said he would come by to talk to them and also search the place to make sure there was no more poison in their house. At this, Paul just kind of mumbled that he'd do his best, and then he hung up. Later that day, Detective Dunbar arrived at Sue and Paul's house, and when he got there, he saw the other detective who was going to help him with the search of the house. Then the two of them walked up to the front door, and Dunbar knocked on the door, and as they waited, Dunbar turned to his colleague and warned them that the family had just come back from Sue's burial, so the mood was going to be very sad and heavy. However, when Paul opened the door, upbeat music was blasting from the stereo, and Dunbar could hear people laughing inside the house. Paul smiled and welcomed the two detectives inside, and he told them that instead of having a gloomy wake, he decided to hold a celebration of Sue's life. He said being sad and crying really didn't help with anything. Dunbar nodded politely, but he shared a quick, suspicious look with the other detective. This was not what either of them had expected at all. Paul pointed them to the bathroom where Sue had died, and he told the detectives that the family had not touched anything inside of there at all. Dunbar then gave Paul a form asking for consent to search the house, and Paul signed it right away. But before the detectives got started, Paul told them he had one question. Dunbar nodded and looked at him intently, curious to hear what this question was. Paul then held up a menu and said he was ordering pizza, and his question was, "Do you want any pizza?" Dunbar knew people grieved in different ways, but he could not get over how relaxed Paul seemed. But he thanked Paul for the offer and said no, they didn't want any pizza, and then they headed down the hall towards the bathroom. Dunbar put on rubber gloves and then stepped into Sue's bathroom and went right for the medicine cabinet. One by one, he took out bottles of prescription medication and over-the-counter pain pills and carefully dropped each one into its own evidence bag. As Dunbar worked, the other detectives searched the rest of the house, looking for anything stored in the closets or garage that in theory could contain cyanide. When Dunbar finally finished in the bathroom, he walked back to the kitchen and he found Paul sitting quietly at the table. By now, most of the guests had left and the music had been shut off and the pizza was getting cold on the counter. Paul seemed to have lost all the energy he'd had when Dunbar and his colleague had first arrived. Dunbar saw an opportunity here, and so he sat down and just began asking Paul questions about where he had been and what he was doing on the morning Sue had died. Paul told Dunbar that he'd left for work before Sue had woken up, and then later that morning, he learned that his stepdaughter, Haley, had found Sue on the bathroom floor. Paul's voice sounded very tired, and his story was very to the point, without any of the extra details that could sometimes indicate a person was making things up. Dunbar wondered if maybe he'd misjudged Paul. Maybe Paul's oddly excited demeanor from earlier was really just his attempt to cope with overwhelming grief and shock. Of course, Paul might also have realized he'd made a very bad first impression on the police, and so maybe now he was just trying to backpedal and act really upset, like the way they would expect him to. So Dunbar wasn't really sure what to make of Paul. After asking Paul a few more questions and feeling satisfied that Paul had told him everything he knew, Dunbar thanked Paul and then excused himself to go talk to Sue's daughters and the other family members who were still in the house. But when he spoke to them, they all seemed totally drained, and none of them really had anything new to share. And so at this point, Dunbar understood that really there was only so much progress he could make without knowing what exactly had poisoned Sue. So he and the other detective thanked the family, they gathered up all their bags of evidence and left to go turn in everything they had found to the lab. At 8 p.m. that night, Detective Dunbar was back at home relaxing by himself when his phone rang. It was a scientist from the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA for short, which is the government agency responsible for ensuring that food and medicines are safe. Dunbar had sent all that evidence he collected at Sue's home to the FDA for testing, but he definitely had not expected a callback so quickly. The FDA scientist told him on the phone that this was a very urgent matter. They had found the source of the cyanide. It was in the Excedrin painkillers inside of Sue's medicine cabinet that she was taking for her headaches. Someone had replaced the powder-filled Excedrin gel caps with gel caps that were filled with cyanide powder. Of the 56 pills that were still inside of the bottle, 7 more contained cyanide. And suddenly, Dunbar knew exactly why the FDA had 1, tested everything so quickly, and 2, reached out to him right away. The implications of these pain pills containing the cyanide was that perhaps Sue was not like a targeted killing. Perhaps the murderer or murderers walked into a pharmacy or multiple pharmacies and just slipped poison pills in with the over-the-counter pain medication. And if that's what happened, there was no way to know if just 1 bottle had been poisoned, or if there were more poison pills out there, either still waiting on store shelves or in unsuspecting people's medicine cabinets. Like, this could be a full-blown national emergency. And this was actually not the first time something like this had happened before. Just 4 years earlier in Chicago, Illinois, 7 people had died after taking cyanide-laced Tylenol they bought in their local pharmacies and grocery stores. When news of the deaths had broken, there was a national panic. And despite the intense investigation that followed the Chicago Tylenol murders, the killer had never been caught. Now, Detective Dunbar realized that the Tylenol killer may have just struck again, or he could be dealing with a copycat killer. Either way, if this killer really was murdering at random through these poison medication bottles, well, figuring out their identity would be very difficult, if not impossible. Dunbar thanked the FDA scientist and hung up. Then he immediately called the chief of police and let him know they might have a large-scale incident on their hands. The city was going to have to put up some kind of an alert. But even though Dunbar realized this case could be on the scale of the infamous Tylenol murders, he wasn't totally convinced that somebody had tampered with Sue's Excedrin in a store. The more simple explanation was that this was not a random murder, that somebody who knew Sue, who had a reason to kill Sue, specifically put cyanide pills in with her Excedrin pills. And if that was the case, Dunbar thought Sue's husband Paul was the most likely suspect. So Dunbar called Paul and told him that it turns out it was specifically the Excedrin that had killed Sue. That's where the cyanide was. And in a calm voice, Paul replied to this by saying that he was not surprised. Dunbar was so shocked by Paul's answer that he just kind of fell silent for a second. He couldn't understand how Paul could have thought the Excedrin was poisoned unless he was the one who poisoned it. Then suddenly, Paul began stammering, and he told the detective that, oh my goodness, I've taken 2 of those exact Excedrin pills myself. I could have died. And then Paul began to hyperventilate over the phone. But the whole thing felt a little too theatrical for Dunbar. For Paul to go from not even being surprised about the Excedrin to suddenly panicking that he could have been a victim himself just felt very performative. So Dunbar asked Paul if anyone had seen him take those Excedrin pills. If this really was Paul's story, Dunbar wanted him to prove it. But Paul, who was still hyperventilating, said no, he was alone when he took the pills. However, this only added to Dunbar's suspicion of Paul. The next morning, when Dunbar grabbed his newspaper off his porch and read the headlines, he grimaced. There on the front page in big letters was the announcement that Excedrin had been recalled across the entire country. Dunbar knew the recall was the right thing to do, but he also thought this was going to spark public hysteria. And when he arrived at the police station later that day, he knew he was right. The station was absolute chaos, with a line of people at the desk. Some of them were yelling out their theories, and others were crying because they were worried they'd taken poisoned Excedrin, even though if they had, they'd already be dead. But they didn't really know that, so they were just totally losing their minds about it. But it wasn't just civilians that were clogging up the police station hallways. An entire busload of FBI agents had descended, and Dunbar watched them setting up a command post in a big conference room. Dunbar pushed his way through the crowd of hysterical people and made his way to his desk, where he found a special agent named Ike Nakamoto waiting for him. Nakamoto was a big, serious-looking guy, but the moment he saw Dunbar, he smiled and shook Dunbar's hand and apologized for the mess. Dunbar had heard stories about how the FBI liked to order local police around, and so he was immediately suspicious of Nakamoto's friendliness. Nakamoto explained that the FBI had been called in as soon as the FDA realized it was the Excedrin that was poisoned. He said that after the Chicago Tylenol murders, the FBI had been given jurisdiction over any investigations that involved poisoned medication. But Nakamoto assured Dunbar that the FBI was there to focus on the product tampering angle, not to take Dunbar's murder case away. Nakamoto said he wanted the detective to continue to investigate Sue's death, and they could even work together and share information. Dunbar managed to smile and said he'd be happy to work together, but he said he still thought the killer was much more likely to be Sue's husband, Paul, than some anonymous poisoner. Paul just seemed off. It was like he was always either underreacting or overreacting, like a guilty man trying to say and do the right thing, rather than an innocent, grieving man reacting to events as they happened. It all just seemed very performative. Paul just kind of seemed like he was acting. And to Dunbar's surprise, Nakamoto nodded and agreed with him. The FBI was discussing all the possibilities, including the idea that, perhaps the Chicago Tylenol murderer had struck again, but they also thought, a local killer here was much more likely. Nakamoto said the FBI was only here to make sure nothing got missed. All day long, FBI agents flooded local pharmacies and grocery stores, taking more than 15,000 bottles of Excedrin off shelves and out of storage rooms and sending them out for testing. And while that was happening, people kept filing into the police station looking for answers. But by the evening, things had finally quieted down around town and at the station, and Detective Dunbar was exhausted and ready to go home. So he picked up his car keys and headed for the door, but right as he was about to leave, Nakamoto stepped out of the room the FBI had taken over and yelled for him to wait. Then Nakamoto rushed over to Dunbar and told him the FBI had just gotten a call from the lab, and they had found another cyanide-laced bottle of Excedrin at a grocery store. Dunbar just hung his head. This meant somebody was almost certainly poisoning medicine at random, likely in the pharmacies or in the grocery store, and this also meant Paul was not nearly as obvious a suspect as Dunbar thought. Now, the killer could be anyone. The next morning, Dunbar arrived back at the police station, thinking his role in the investigation was over. It seemed pretty clear that the killer was poisoning bottles at random, which was way beyond anything Dunbar or his small police department had the resources to handle. But as a team of FBI agents headed out the door to interview people at the grocery store where that second tainted bottle was found, Special Agent Nakamoto approached Dunbar and told him he wanted to keep their two parallel investigations running. Nakamoto said the second bottle could just be a decoy, so the FBI would pursue the theory that the killer was a random poisoner, but Dunbar should keep his investigation alive, looking into Sue's life, in case the killer was connected to her. Dunbar felt rejuvenated, and the first thing he did was head right to the bank where Sue worked. He still wasn't sure what to make of Paul, and so he figured maybe Sue's co-workers could give him a fresh angle to pursue. Dunbar walked into the bank, and the atmosphere was quiet and stuffy. He worried that Sue's co-workers might not open up. But he asked a woman working behind one of the desks if she'd be willing to answer some questions about Sue, and the woman's face lit up. She immediately grabbed Dunbar's arm, pulled him into an empty office, and began gossiping like they were old friends. She said that Sue was very flirtatious and had a hot temper. One time, somebody Sue went to lunch with had even left an angry note on Sue's desk afterward, accusing her of being promiscuous. Sue always claimed that her flirting was not cheating, but the coworker had always wondered if maybe Sue's behavior really bothered Paul. And she said there was more. People close to Sue knew Paul had cheated on Sue, and so they theorized that maybe all of Sue's flirting was Sue's way of getting back at Paul. Detective Dunbar thanked Sue's coworker, and then talked to a few more people at the bank, and then headed to the station to inform Nakamoto that Sue and Paul's marriage might have been way more strained than anybody realized. But when Dunbar got to the station, Nakamoto was waiting on the steps with 2 coffees in his hands. He handed one to Dunbar and told him he had big news. Now, most of the people who had called into the police station worried that they or their loved ones had been poisoned by Excedrin that was laced with cyanide were people who were just reacting to headlines and being paranoid. But it would turn out one of them was right. There had been another death from cyanide poisoning in town, and it happened 3 days before Sue's death. Nakamoto said the victim was a man named Bruce Nickel, and he had died suddenly of what doctors thought was emphysema, which is a very serious lung disease. But Bruce's wife, Stella, did not believe that because Bruce had never been diagnosed with emphysema. So a couple of days after Bruce's death, when Stella saw the news about Sue and the Excedrin, she called the FBI saying her husband had died very mysteriously not long before Sue, and so maybe he had died from cyanide. Now, by this point, her husband Bruce had actually already been buried, but he had donated his eyes. So a vial of Bruce's blood had been taken to determine blood type, and then that blood had been stored at the blood bank. So the FBI sent that blood out for testing, and it would turn out it was positive for cyanide. Detective Dunbar didn't know what to say. After his trip to the bank, he'd convinced himself all over again that Paul must have been Sue's killer, retaliating that she was flirting and potentially cheating on him. But Bruce Nickel's death would mean that Paul killed 2 people, one of them 3 days before Sue. And so Dunbar wanted to go talk to Bruce's wife, Stella, to see if maybe there was some connection between Bruce and Sue. But Nakamoto stopped him and reminded Dunbar that the tampering angle was the FBI's case, and so Nakamoto would interview Bruce's wife Stella, and then he would tell Dunbar what he learned. The next afternoon, Special Agent Nakamoto arrived at the mobile home where Stella and her daughter lived. Stella opened the door and invited him into a small room that was dominated by a huge fish tank. Nakamoto sat down on the couch and watched Stella's brightly colored exotic fish dart back and forth. Stella watched him and told him she actually had a dream of opening up an exotic fish store of her own someday. Nakamoto smiled and said the fish were beautiful. Then, in a gentle voice, he asked Stella to please tell him what happened to her husband. But Stella said there really wasn't much to tell. Bruce had gone outside on the deck to get some fresh air, and then suddenly he collapsed. She said he had just taken a handful of Excedrin, and usually he took 4 pills at once. Nakamoto nodded and then asked Stella if she remembered where and when these pills had been purchased. Stella said she didn't, but Bruce saved all their receipts for tax purposes. So she got up and then quickly returned with a small box full of receipts. She said Nakamoto might have to dig a little bit, but she was almost positive he would find the receipt he needed. And so Nakamoto took the box, thanked Stella for her time, and then headed out the door. But as he walked outside, Stella's daughter, Cindy, pulled up in her car and got out, and unlike Stella, Cindy was furious. Nakamoto wasn't even down the steps before Cindy launched into a tirade, saying she couldn't believe the police were here questioning her family, like they would never hurt Bruce. Nakamoto tried to explain that, her mother, and Cindy for that matter, were not being treated like suspects here, but Cindy just cut him off and went from being angry to kind of sounding really heartbroken, and she said Bruce had died right when his life seemed to be turning around. She said Bruce had been an alcoholic, but he'd gone to rehab, he'd stopped drinking, and things had never been better. And then Cindy dropped her head into her hands and looked like she was crying, and Nakamoto just said, "Look, I'm only here to ask everybody questions. That's how we're going to figure out who killed Bruce." But Cindy just continued to cry and said it just didn't seem fair. It's like everything had been going so well for him. How could this happen? Nakamoto just said how sorry he was, and he told Cindy he would find the person who did this. Over the next few days, Nakamoto and his team tried to track down the source of the cyanide that was used to poison the Excedrin to see if they could figure out where the killer purchased it. Even though cyanide is obviously deadly, it's actually widely available. It's used in photography, jewelry making, drug manufacturing, and lots of other industries. And so quickly, the FBI realized that trying to track this down was kind of a dead end. There were too many places it could have come from. Meanwhile, the public pressure to solve the case was only intensifying. A group of drug companies whose stock had tanked following the Tylenol murders, and now also these Excedrin murders, put up a $300,000 reward for any information that led to an arrest. To Nakamoto, it seemed like whoever had poisoned the Excedrin was likely a local who was familiar with the grocery stores in the area. So he didn't think the murders of Bruce and Sue were related to the Chicago Tylenol murders. But he was absolutely certain that whoever killed Bruce also killed Sue, because an FDA lab had confirmed that the cyanide used in both murders had clearly come from the exact same source. even though they couldn't actually identify what that source was. In both of the tainted capsules, there were these strange green flecks all mixed in with the poison, which made it impossible to identify who manufactured the cyanide, but it was unique enough that it meant this was the same batch of cyanide. So by the end of June, 3 weeks after Sue and Bruce had died, even though Nakamoto and Dunbar had made progress on their cases, it just kind of felt like every avenue they had pursued had led to a dead end, with regards to actually figuring out who did this. Dunbar still thought Paul was the best suspect, but there was absolutely no evidence that Paul had killed Sue, much less Bruce, and so both investigations began to drag, and several months went by with no new leads. Dunbar and Nakamoto were getting more and more frustrated because they had both worked almost non-stop on their parallel cases, and both basically had nothing to show for it. In December of 1986, 6 months after the murders, Special Agent Nakamoto heard another agent calling his name from across the FBI command center. He waved Nakamoto over to take the phone. Nakamoto headed across the room, and despite the other agent's obvious excitement, Nakamoto tempered his expectations. Over the past several months, countless people had called into the hotline, but most of those tips had gone nowhere. Nakamoto figured most people were calling in a desperate attempt to try to cash in on the $300,000 reward those drug companies had offered. And so Nakamoto grabbed the phone and introduced himself, and right away the caller said they knew who had killed both Sue Snow and Bruce Nichol. Nakamoto exhaled, expecting another long-winded theory that really had nothing to do with the case, but as this caller explained how they knew who the killer was, a stunned look came across Nakamoto's face. This caller pointed to evidence leading to the killer that had been right in front of investigators, but they had overlooked it. Nakamoto ended the call and quickly rallied his team. He wanted them to follow up on the details this caller had provided. At this point, Nakamoto was sure that he had just figured out who Sue and Bruce's killer was. On a summer day in 1986, the killer put on a pair of gloves and then poured a vial of powdered cyanide into a bowl. Then they reached into a bag and pulled out an empty gel capsule. They opened it up, and then using one end, they scooped up the cyanide powder and then took the other end and closed the capsule back up, sealing the poison inside. On the table in front of them were a row of untampered-with Excedrin bottles. The killer picked up one of them, carefully removed the safety seal and lid, and then shook one uncontaminated capsule out into their palm. They then held it up to the cyanide pill they had just made. No one would be able to tell the difference. After replacing the cyanide pill in the bottle they had just opened up, they did the same thing with the other bottles, basically taking out a handful of good pills and replacing them with more cyanide pills. When the killer was done, they carefully glued the plastic safety seals back onto all of these now tampered-with Excedrin bottles and put the lids back on them. Then the killer put those tainted bottles in a shopping bag and walked out to their car. The killer drove to a grocery store, went inside, and headed for the pharmacy aisle. Once they were there, they looked around to make sure nobody was watching. Then they reached into their bag, pulled out a poisoned bottle of Excedrin, and placed it on the shelf with all the others, and it looked like it belonged there. Satisfied with their handiwork, the killer walked back outside. And then, just hours later, Sue Snow walked into that same grocery store and happened to buy that exact poisoned bottle of Excedrin that would kill her. But it would turn out the killer, who thought they had gotten away with it, had left behind one telltale clue. Those green flecks mixed in with the cyanide, the flecks that had baffled investigators and made it impossible to trace the source of the cyanide, well, it would turn out those flecks were dust from an algae pill used to keep the water clean in large fish tanks. And with that clue, Agent Nakamoto and his team came to realize that about a week before Sue ever stepped into that store, Stella Nichol had used tainted Excedrin to kill her husband, Bruce. Stella had crushed up the cyanide she had put in her husband's Excedrin in the same bowl she used to crush up the algae pills she used in her fish tank. And remnants of that algae showed up in samples of the tainted Excedrin. The tipster who had reached out to the FBI was Stella's own daughter, Cindy. It was Cindy who had at first insisted to Agent Nakamoto that nobody in her family would ever hurt Bruce, that they were the happiest they'd ever been since Bruce stopped drinking. But now, Cindy had a different story to tell. She said her mother, Stella, hated who Bruce had become after he quit drinking. Instead of getting dressed up and going to bars and hanging out with friends, Stella and Bruce now just stayed home all the time, and so Stella was bored. She missed her old life, and she felt like Bruce's new sobriety was holding her back. Cindy said Stella had even talked to her about how easy it would be to recreate the Chicago Tylenol murders and make it look like somebody had overdosed. Despite that, Cindy had tried to convince herself after Bruce's death that her mother's comments were just a weird coincidence. But then 6 months after the murders, Stella told Cindy she was going to use Bruce's life insurance money to live out her dream and open up a tropical fish store. And at this point, Cindy couldn't deny it anymore. She felt nearly certain that Stella must have killed Bruce for his money. Stella could have gotten away with this whole thing, but Bruce's autopsy didn't pick up the cyanide. Instead, the coroner listed Bruce's cause of death as emphysema. And that was actually a bad thing for Stella, because the life insurance policy she had on Bruce paid an extra $100,000 if his cause of death was accidental, i.e. cyanide, accidentally consumed cyanide, that's what she was hoping it would be, rather than emphysema, which is considered, a natural cause death, and so therefore would not be considered accidental. And so when Stella found out about this, she went back to the store with more cyanide pills because she needed another cyanide death, to be able to have her own husband's cause of death reinvestigated. And Sue just happened to be the unfortunate victim who grabbed that bottle off the shelf that Stella had left. It would turn out Paul had nothing to do with Sue's murder. She was literally a random victim. Stella was arrested by the FBI and charged with 2 counts of causing death by product tampering. She was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 90 years in prison. Stella's daughter, Cindy, would receive $250,000 of that $300,000 reward the drug companies had offered. As for Sue's daughters, they received money in an out-of-court settlement with the drug manufacturer. They put it towards their college education, which is what they thought their mother would have wanted them to do. 58-year-old Charmin Stock woke up early on Easter Sunday, April 16, 2006. She was sure she heard the sound of raindrops on the roof of her 2-story white farmhouse. She sat up in bed, already worried that her Easter egg hunt that she had planned for her 4 grandchildren that afternoon would be rained out. But just a second later, her husband of 48 years, Wayne Stock, reached over and gave her a gentle, reassuring pat on her back. Wayne knew how much his wife loved Easter. "Don't worry," he told her. "It's not rain, it's just the wind. I checked the weather last night, and it's going to be a beautiful day." At around 6:30 in the morning, the couple got out of bed, and Charmin headed downstairs to the kitchen to make sure that each of the Easter baskets she had put together for her grandchildren were perfect. Then she opened the refrigerator and started prepping food for the big family dinner she was going to make later that day. And as she did this, she looked out the window, and just like her husband had predicted, the sun was already starting to poke through the clouds. Just an hour later, dressed in their best clothes, these Stocks were sitting inside Ebenezer United Methodist Church, saying hello to their neighbors and friends, catching up on local news, and just really enjoying one of their favorite holidays. The Stocks lived in a tiny town in eastern Nebraska called Murdoch. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other and no one was worried about leaving their doors unlocked. In this tight-knit village of 270 people, Wayne and Charmin were especially well-liked and respected. They were active in the church, mentoring teens and teaching Sunday school. They also served on the school board, and Wayne had served in the Nebraska National Guard. Charmin had spent 17 years as a teacher's aide in the local elementary school, and now she operated a small business out of her house making specialty wedding cakes. In addition to the 1,000 acres of land Charmin and Wayne owned and farmed, the Stocks also had a successful business growing and selling hay. At 9:40 a.m., the organ music started and the congregation quieted down. As the couple waited in silence for the greeting from their pastor, Wayne and Charmin bowed their heads and gave thanks for all their blessings. On their way out of the church that morning after the service, Pastor Joe Wacker asked the Stocks what they were up to for the rest of the day to celebrate the holiday. As Charmin told him excitedly about her Easter egg hunt that she had planned for her grandkids, Pastor Joe smiled. People like Charmin and Wayne were the glue that held their families and communities together. And in a few hours, under a partly sunny sky, Wayne and Charmin were out in the backyard of their home, chatting with their married children and in-laws, and watching their 4 grandkids look along the edge of the barn for the brightly colored eggs that Charmin had hidden as soon as she had gotten home from church. Andrew Stock, the son who would one day take over the family hay business, was spending Easter with his fiance's family. But he had told his parents that he would be by their place that evening to pick up his dog. Andrew had just gotten a new puppy, and that morning he had dropped it off with his parents so that they could look after it for the day. So at around 8 p.m. that night, just as the Stocks had put away the last dinner dishes and picked up the house, they heard the sound of Andrew's truck in their driveway. It had turned into such a beautiful and clear and mild evening that the three of them decided to just stay outside on the back deck and chat for a bit. Sharman told Andrew all about the Easter egg hunt and how much the grandkids loved it. Then Andrew and his dad spent a few minutes chatting about hay prices and what needed to be done around the farm. Andrew told his father that he'd be back over the next morning to work in their hay office, and then Andrew picked up his tired puppy that had fallen asleep in the kitchen. He got back into his truck, he waved to his parents, and then he headed back down their driveway to the main road. As he looked in his rearview mirror, he saw his mom and dad turn towards their front door, take each other's hands, and step back inside of their house. The next morning, Andrew got up early, he grabbed a cup of coffee, and he headed outside to his truck. He drove the roughly 30 minutes to his parents' house, pulling into the parking area just outside of the office building for their hay operations, which was a small standalone structure set a ways back from the farmhouse. His mom and dad were both early risers, and his dad liked to get started on his chores right after breakfast. So as Andrew walked toward the hay office, he thought it was odd when he glanced over in the direction of the farmhouse and saw his father's truck still parked outside where he had left it the night before. So before going into the office to start his day, Andrew decided to go check the garage that was near the hay office and see if maybe his dad had just decided that morning to drive his wife's car instead of his own truck. But when Andrew went inside the garage, his mom's car was still there. Andrew suddenly felt like maybe something was wrong. The quickest way to get in touch with his parents from where he was just to call them on the office phone rather than walk or drive all the way across the property to the farmhouse. So quickly, Andrew left the garage and went into the hay office building and picked up the phone to dial their number. However, when he put the phone to his ear, his sense of worry rapidly turned into alarm because there was no dial tone coming out of the phone. It was disconnected. And Andrew could not think of a single reason why his parents would have disconnected their landline. It made no sense. So Andrew, now panicking, rushed out of the office, hopped in his truck, and sped across the big property to his parents' farmhouse. At 2 minutes before 9 a.m., Andrew knocked loudly on his parents' side door. When he didn't hear anything, he turned the knob and discovered that the door was unlocked. He stepped inside and immediately called out to his parents, but the house was quiet. And the kitchen, where he could always find his mom and a fresh pot of coffee, was empty. Andrew began to pray out loud that his parents would be okay as he walked from the kitchen toward the stairs that would lead to the second floor. As he walked up the stairs, he did what he'd done since he was a child. Without thinking, he dragged his right hand along the wall. And as he did, he felt something a little bit rough under his fingertips. When he turned to see what it was, he saw dark red smears and little red spots all over the wallpaper. And when he got to the top of the stairs and could see into the second floor hallway and master bedroom just beyond, Andrew saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Andrew turned around and ran back down the stairs out to his pickup truck, where he frantically grabbed his cell phone and dialed 911. 12 minutes later, the ambulance arrived. The medics pushed past Andrew and they went into his parents' house and headed up the stairs. When they reached the top, where Andrew had been standing 15 minutes earlier, they found Andrew's father, Wayne, lying in a pool of congealed blood. Just beyond Wayne, through the open master bedroom door, the medics could see another body. It was Wayne's wife and Andrew's mother, Sharman. She was lying on her back on the floor next to the bed. Her legs were outstretched towards the door, and a telephone receiver was still in her hand, like she had been trying to place a call when she died. Although the medics sprang into action looking for any signs of life on either of them, they knew their attempts were futile. It was immediately clear to them, as it had been to Andrew, that Wayne and Sharman were both dead. By the time police arrived, just 8 minutes after the ambulance had pulled up to the house, Andrew was on the phone with his brother and sister, telling them that something horrible had happened to their parents, and they needed to get out to the farmhouse as fast as they could. His sister Tammy remembered thinking at the time that whatever had happened, her brother must be exaggerating. The sleepy little town of Murdoch where they lived had to be one of the safest places in the world, and Tammy knew her parents were in good health. She had just spent the day before, Easter Sunday, laughing and talking with them, so they had to be just fine. But as she left work and climbed into her car, Tammy found herself repeating a prayer over and over again. The good Lord protects us. The good Lord protects us. But only a few minutes later, she would arrive at the farmhouse and would learn that both of her parents had been murdered. Tammy and her two siblings, Andrew and Steve, weren't the only people who were shocked and horrified by what had happened to Wayne and Charmin Stock. Local police had never seen anything like the grisly crime scene they discovered inside the farmhouse, and as word spread throughout Murdoch, the Stock's neighbors and friends also reacted with total disbelief. The investigation into the murders was immediately assigned to the local sheriff's office, but the sheriff knew he did not have the manpower or the experience to deal with this kind of a crime. So before he even left the crime scene that day, he called the state police and the nearest Nebraska Crime Scene Investigation Unit and asked them for help. Both organizations agreed and promised to have some of their people in Murdoch within the hour. The commander of the Crime Scene Investigation Unit was a man named David Caffode, a criminal profiler and legendary crime scene investigator who had a reputation for finding forensic evidence that everyone else had overlooked. While investigators from the sheriff's office started to conduct interviews with friends and family of Wayne and Charmin, David walked into the Stocks farmhouse for the first time. After examining the crime scene and looking at the few pieces of evidence police had collected, which included a few firearm shell casings, a red and silver marijuana pipe, and a small LED flashlight, David Caffode quickly reached two conclusions. The first was that the attack must have been personal, that the attackers knew the Stocks. He based this largely on the fact that violent crime was so rare in Murdoch. Also, the farmhouse did not appear to have been ransacked, which made it highly unlikely that it was a robbery gone wrong. The second conclusion David came to was that there likely had been two killers. He based this on a host of factors, including the positioning of the bodies and the blood spatter on the walls. On his way off the property, David told the state and local police that he believed this was a revenge killing carried out by two young men. He told the investigators that they should be looking for men who had a grudge against Wayne or Charmin or both, or who were at or near the Stock property in the last 24 hours. Since Andrew Stock had been the last person to see his parents alive, police quickly brought him in for questioning. But after only a few hours, they could tell he was not involved. There was absolutely no history of any trouble between him and his parents, and there was no financial motive since Andrew was already in line to inherit the family hay business. But police could not say the same thing for another member of the Stock family, Andrew's cousin, 28-year-old Matt Livers, who was the son of Wayne Stock's brother. Several relatives had told investigators that Matt had a history of conflict with Wayne and Charmin, who were his uncle and aunt, including a disagreement over who would inherit a house that belonged to Wayne and Charmin. So at about 11 p.m. on April 17th, 14 hours after the gruesome discovery at the Stocks farmhouse, a state police investigator and a sheriff county investigator brought Matt into the local police station for questioning. Although Matt admitted to arguing with his aunt and uncle, he denied any involvement in their murders. 4 hours later, when the police had not been able to find anything that connected Matt to the crime, he was allowed to return to the house he shared with his girlfriend in nearby Lincoln, Nebraska. In the meantime, other investigators had gotten a description of a light tan sedan car that a paper carrier had seen early on the morning of the 17th, parked near a fence between the Stocks property and an adjacent cemetery. The paper carrier also told police that this same car had passed him going very fast in the general vicinity of the Stocks home the night before. State and local investigators soon found a car that matched that description. It was a 1998 Ford Contour that belonged to a man named William Sampson, whose 21-year-old brother, Nicholas Sampson, happened to be the cousin of Matt Livers. On April 20th, 3 days after the killings, the Crime Scene Investigation Unit conducted a thorough examination of the Ford Contour. Although they did not find any physical or forensic evidence that linked the car to the Stock murders, they did discover that the car had recently been thoroughly cleaned and wiped down. So even without hard evidence, the fact that officers could draw a connection between a potentially suspicious vehicle and Matt Livers, and that Matt was the only suspect police could identify who had a personal motive for hurting Wayne and Sharman, investigators tightened their focus on Matt. They kept him under surveillance, they examined the trash he removed from his home, and they questioned his friends and his coworkers. Then, on the morning of Tuesday, April 25th, which was 8 days after the Stocks had been killed, investigators brought Matt Livers into the station where they gave him a lie detector test. After the test, they brought him into a room for another round of interrogation. Despite Matt repeatedly saying he had nothing to do with the murders, no one believed him. And at the conclusion of this 11-hour straight interrogation session, police would tell Matt that he failed his lie detector test. Shortly after hearing this, Matt Livers confessed that he and his cousin, Nicholas, had in fact killed Wayne and Sharman Stock. The Stock children were devastated all over again. Not only had they lost their parents, but now members of their own family had admitted to committing the murders. They did not want to believe it, and aside from Matt's confession, there still was no hard evidence actually linking Matt or Nicholas to the killings, and so some of the Stock family actually held out hope that maybe there had been a mistake. But that would change on May 8th, 3 weeks after Wayne and Sharman were found. Known for his thoroughness, the legendary crime scene investigator David Caffode ordered a second examination of the inside of the Ford Contour. And this time, he conducted the search himself. After going over the car interior 1 inch at a time, David discovered a single speck of blood underneath the dashboard. DNA testing showed that the blood belonged to Wayne Stock. This was the official nail in the coffin for Matt and his cousin Nicholas. They were both promptly charged with murder and sent to jail to await trial. While the residents of Murdoch breathed a sigh of relief knowing the killers were now behind bars, the police announced publicly that the bloody crime that had sent fear and shockwaves through the town and that had made headlines in the national press had been solved and the case was closed. Or rather, it would have been closed if it hadn't been for a single question raised by a young investigator named Christine Gabig, who worked in the sheriff's crime lab that had analyzed the evidence collected at the scene of the Stock murders. 2 days after the discovery of the marijuana pipe and LED flashlight that police had found outside of the Stock's house on April 17th, just hours after Andrew had discovered his parents' bodies, police, who were doing a final sweep of the crime scene, found a man's gold ring on the floor out of sight in the Stock's kitchen. The ring did not belong to either Wayne or Sharman, but the team investigating the murders did not think the ring could be connected to their case. They decided it was more likely that the ring had just been dropped in the kitchen sometime in the past by any number of visitors or family members, and no one had found it until now. But to Christine, the ring was a loose end that needed to be tied up. She knew Sharman ran her cake business out of her kitchen, and after asking around, it turned out Sharman had a reputation for being a perfectionist who kept her kitchen immaculately clean at all times. And so Christine's thinking to herself, how is it possible that Sharman is in this kitchen all the time, constantly cleaning it up and constantly making sure it's perfect? How does she not find this ring when we found it within a couple of hours of being in her house? It just didn't make any sense. Christine decided she would try to track down the owner of the ring to see how it wound up in the Stock household. When she looked at the ring, she saw there was a jeweler's mark on it, as well as an inscription that said, "Love always, Corey and Ryan." The inscription was distinctive because it was on the outside of the ring rather than the inside of the gold band. It took a while, but finally, in mid-May of that year, Christine was able to trace the jeweler's mark to A&A Jewelers in Buffalo, New York. Christine picked up the phone and she called the number for the store, and it would turn out, had she waited even a few hours longer to make that call, she likely never would have figured out who this ring belonged to. Because the day Christine called that jewelry store was literally the day they were going out of business. Mary Martino, who was an employee at this jewelry store, was about to disconnect the phone line when the phone rang. She picked it up, and without even waiting for an answer, she told the caller, who was Christine, that they were shutting down the store for good and, best of luck to you, and she was about to hang up. But Christine butted in and said, "Please, I'm a police officer and I need your help finding the owner of a ring that you sold. It's involved in a homicide case." Mary was very surprised to hear this, and also pretty excited. The idea of assisting in a murder case was kind of thrilling. So Mary spent the next 3 days and 2 nights in the jewelry store's warehouse tracking down the order for that gold band. 4 days later, Mary called Christine back and told her that the ring had been shipped to a Walmart in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. 70 phone calls to Wisconsin later, and Christine had found the ring's owner, a man named Ryan who lived 2 full states away from Murdock, Nebraska. The ring had been a gift from his ex-girlfriend, Corey. Christine could just about see Ryan shaking his head on the other end of the line. He said, "I have no idea how my ring got to Nebraska." It turned out that Ryan's ring had been inside the glove compartment of his red Dodge Ram pickup truck, and that truck had been stolen in Wisconsin on April 15th, 500 miles away from Murdock, Nebraska, and 2 days before the murders of Wayne and Sharman Stock. And then Ryan's truck had been found abandoned a few days later on April 18th in Louisiana, 3 states away from Murdock, Nebraska. And the people who police believed had stolen Ryan's truck, 17-year-old Jessica Reed and 19-year-old Greg Fester, were already in police custody in Wisconsin. On June 6th, roughly 2 weeks after Christine made this discovery about the ring, the same 2 investigators who had gotten Matt Livers to confess to the murders of Wayne and Sharman Stock arrived in Dodge County, Wisconsin, and conducted separate interviews with Jessica and her boyfriend Greg, who'd been accused of not only stealing Ryan's pickup truck, but also going on a 4-day crime spree over that Easter weekend that took them from Wisconsin to Louisiana. And needless to say, investigators were shocked at what the teenaged couple told them. They claimed that they knew who killed Wayne and Sharman Stock, and it was not Matt Livers and Nicholas Sampson. Based on those interviews with Jessica and Greg, and new evidence that police would uncover over the next 5 months, the police would come to the same conclusion as the teenagers. Matt and Nicholas were innocent. They did not kill Wayne and Sharman Stock. The following is a reconstruction of what actually happened to the Stock couple. But before we get into the rest of the story, I'd like to talk to you about today's sponsors. Okay, back to the story. Back on Saturday, April 15th, 2006, the day before Easter, 17-year-old Jessica Reed and her 19-year-old boyfriend, Greg Fester, left their small apartment in Horicon, Wisconsin to take a road trip west so they could go see the ocean for the first time. Jessica, who had once been a high school honor student and cheerleader, had dropped out of high school following her parents' divorce. She had started using drugs and began dating Greg, who had a long history of drug and alcohol abuse, as well as an extensive criminal record. Greg was also in and out of treatment for psychiatric disorders. The young couple didn't have a car of their own, so they began their road trip by stealing and then abandoning 2 different vehicles. Apparently they hadn't liked either of them. They also broke into an empty house and stole a 12-gauge shotgun, ammunition, and an envelope full of cash. They eventually reached a farm where they saw Ryan's red Dodge pickup truck, and the couple thought that vehicle was perfect for them. So Greg hotwired the truck, and he and Jessica hopped in and started to drive west. As they drove, they got high on marijuana, cocaine, and dextromethorphan, which is a stimulant found in cough medication. Eventually, Greg turned the truck and headed southwest to the bordering state of Iowa. It was around this point that the couple stopped talking about wanting to go to the ocean to go see it for the first time. Now they were just solely focused on trying to rob as many people as they possibly could because they wanted money, and it seemed like they kind of enjoyed it. So on their way through Iowa, they robbed 2 more houses, vandalizing the first and stealing another shotgun, ammunition, and $300 from the second house. Then, on April 16th, Easter Day, the couple crossed from Iowa into Nebraska. As the day wore on, the towns they passed through were located very far apart, separated by miles and miles of cornfields or empty tracts of flat land. At this point, they started arguing about what houses they should rob next. Jessica thought they should just take the next thing that comes along because of how far apart everything was. But Greg, who was starting to feel jumpy and irritable as he came down from his massive cough medication high, rejected all of Jessica's suggestions. Feeling annoyed, Jessica just started to ignore him. Jessica had already searched the glove compartment of this truck for money when they first got in, and she hadn't found any. But now that she was bored and kind of angry with Greg, she just reached down and opened the glove compartment again to see if, maybe she had missed something. Feeling around in the back of this glove compartment, Jessica found a man's gold ring with an inscription on the outside of the band that read, "Love always, Corey and Ryan." Jessica, whose shoulder-length blonde hair, childlike face, and small frame made her look more like she was 14 rather than 17, slipped the ring onto her thumb. It was way too big, but she liked it and decided to wear it anyway. As she and Greg drove west across Nebraska and day turned into night, Jessica told Greg he really needed to stop being so picky about what house they were going to rob. There just weren't that many choices. And so finally, in the early morning hours of April 17th, as they drove down another long rural road, Greg suddenly put on the brakes. He could see a white 2-story farmhouse with several outbuildings scattered around it, set back from the road. All the lights were out, and from his perspective, he couldn't see any vehicles parked anywhere nearby, and so to him, that meant no one was home. He turned to Jessica and told her this was it. This was the house they were going to rob. He switched off the headlights of the truck, and then he turned down the Stocks driveway and began moving towards their farmhouse. As they got closer, he told Jessica to grab one of the shotguns just in case there were dogs on the property, and he grabbed the other, making sure both of them were loaded. Then, after he parked the truck in front of the farmhouse, he stuffed a few more shells into the pocket of his jacket and told Jessica to get out of the truck. Crouching down and trying to make as little noise as he could, Greg walked toward the side of the house looking for a way to get inside. And he didn't have to look for very long, because within a couple of minutes, Greg found an unlocked window leading into the laundry room on the first floor. He lifted the screen and crawled through the opening into the house. Then he opened the back door and let Jessica inside. They didn't stay long on the first floor of the house before heading upstairs, but they did stay long enough that while passing through the kitchen, Ryan's gold ring on Jessica's thumb slipped off and rolled out of sight somewhere on the floor. Jessica either didn't notice or didn't try to look for it. The pair quietly made their way up the stairs, but before reaching the top, they stopped. Very clearly, they could hear the sound of someone upstairs snoring. This house was not empty. Without discussing what they were going to do, Greg, who was in the lead, simply just kept on walking up the stairs, and Jessica followed. The couple moved down the second-floor hallway to the master bedroom at the end of the hall where Wayne and Charmin were fast asleep. What happened next, only Greg and Jessica can understand. Greg pushed open the master bedroom door and made no attempt at concealment. Instead, he reached out and flipped the switch on the wall, flooding the bedroom with light. The sound of the door opening and the sudden brightness caused Wayne to wake up, completely alert, his adrenaline flowing even though he had not consciously processed the threat that he and his wife were now facing. Wayne, who was this very stocky and strong-looking guy, began violently trying to rip his covers off so he could get up and confront these people that were in the room with him. And so as Wayne is doing this, Jessica screams at Greg, "Do something!" As Wayne stood up on the bedroom floor, Greg raised his 12-gauge shotgun and he fired a shot into Wayne's kneecap. Even though Wayne's knee was destroyed with bits of bone and flesh poking out of this huge hole where the shot had passed through, Wayne dove toward Greg, shouting as he tried to grab the gun out of Greg's hands. The struggle took them out of the bedroom and into the hallway where Jessica had retreated to, and as the two men wrestled on the ground, Greg yelled at Jessica, "Shoot him!" Jessica didn't hesitate. As Wayne looked up at her, she aimed the shotgun right at his face, and then she fired a single shot into his right eye. A second later, Greg was back up on his feet. He reached down, picked up his shotgun, and he aimed it at Wayne's head, and he fired another shot. This time, literally blowing off the back of Wayne's skull and sending blood spatter all over the stairway wall and creating a silhouette outline of where Jessica, now covered in blood, was standing with her gun in her hands. As soon as Wayne had stopped moving, Greg and Jessica turned their attention back to the master bedroom. They calmly walked back inside and saw Charmin standing next to the bed, crying and screaming hysterically as she desperately tried to call 911 for help. Greg walked across the room until he was standing directly in front of Charmin, who by now was so scared she was just standing there whimpering with the phone in her hand. Greg raised his shotgun until it was level with Charmin's face. Then Greg fired another shot. Despite the shotgun blast blowing off most of Charmin's face, she did not die right away. As Jessica and Greg turned to leave the master bedroom and head back downstairs, Charmin let out a single piercing scream of pure agony that echoed through the house. Covered in blood, with that scream still ringing in their ears, Jessica and Greg stumbled back outside, dropping ammo and shell casings, along with an LED flashlight onto the driveway as they headed for the truck. When they pulled open the doors to the vehicle and clambered inside, their red and silver marijuana pipe rolled off the seat onto the driveway. Greg gunned the engine, and the Dodge Ram pickup truck went speeding away from the Stocks farmhouse. After hearing Jessica's stunning confession that she and her boyfriend, not Matt Livers and Nicholas Sampson, had committed those heinous murders, law enforcement officers in Wisconsin soon discovered more evidence in Jessica's home that linked the teenage lovers to the Stock murders. One piece of evidence was Jessica's journal. On April 22nd, 5 days after she and Greg had killed the Stocks, Jessica had made this entry in her diary. "I killed someone. He was older. I loved it. I wish I could do it all the time. If Greg doesn't watch it, I'm going to leave one day and go do it myself." Police also discovered a letter Jessica had written and left for Greg at their apartment. It was folded up in a cigarette box that also contained a spent 12-gauge shell casing from the murders. In the letter, she wrote, "And this bullet, well, Bunny, it's the only thing left, and I loved it, but that's something we will talk about one day." But even after Jessica and Greg had confessed to the murders, and even though investigators from Wisconsin as well as Nebraska now had a treasure trove of evidence linking the teenagers to the crime, Matt Livers and his cousin Nicholas Sampson still remained incarcerated. Armed with Matt Livers' confession and the speck of Wayne Stock's blood inside the Ford Contour, state and local investigators were sure that Livers and his cousin must have had something to do with this crime. It wasn't until the FBI and lawyers for Matt and Nick stepped in that investigators in Nebraska finally stopped insisting that Matt and Nicholas were also involved in the murders. Lawyers for Matt Livers produced evidence that his confession to killing his aunt and uncle had been coerced, and that he had recanted that confession the day after he made it. It would turn out Matt Livers had an IQ of 63, which meant he was developmentally disabled. And videotapes of his interrogation showed police feeding him the information they wanted him to tell them, until finally, after 11 hours of badgering and threats of facing the death penalty unless he cooperated with police, Matt agreed that he had committed the murders. And when he was pressed by police to name his accomplice, he chose his cousin because Nick had access to a car that matched the description of the light tan vehicle that police said they spotted near the Stocks farmhouse on the morning before the murders were discovered. And even though Matt had been told by police that he failed his lie detector test, in reality, it's likely the results had been misread or misinterpreted. During the first week of October 2006, Nicholas Sampson, who had been incarcerated for the last 5 months, was released and the state dropped all charges against him. 2 months after that, in December, Matt Livers, who had been locked up for the last 7 months, was also released and had his charges dropped as well. In January of 2007, Jessica Reed and Greg Fester both pleaded guilty to 2 counts each of second-degree murder. Before her prison sentence was announced, in a written statement submitted to the judge in her case, Jessica Reed pleaded for mercy, saying that the sound of Charmin Stock's final piercing scream, after her face had been shot off, still woke Jessica up at night. The judge was not moved. On March 19th, 2007, Jessica Reed and Greg Fester were both sentenced to life in prison. But before it was all over, there would be one more twist. In late 2007, the FBI got a tip that the legendary crime scene investigator David Kafode most likely planted that single speck of Wayne Stock's blood that had been found during the second search of the Ford Contour. Prior to that blood being found, the only thing police had connecting Matt and Nicholas to the crime were their confessions. And so David planting that blood is what ultimately put them behind bars. On June 2nd, 2010, 3 years after Jessica and Greg went to prison and 4 years after the state of Nebraska finally dropped all charges against Matt Livers and Nicholas Sampson, David Kafode was sentenced to 20 months to 4 years in prison for falsifying evidence in the Stock murder investigation. And in October 2013, faced with civil lawsuits filed by Matt Livers and Nicholas Sampson, the state of Nebraska awarded a $2.5 million settlement to be split between the two men in compensation for their treatment at the hands of Cass County law enforcement officers during the investigation of the Stock murders. As for Andrew Stock, who discovered his parents' bodies on the morning after Easter 2006, justice may have been served, but his family will never recover from their loss. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the 5-star review button some scrambled eggs for breakfast, but leave an awkward amount of eggshell bits in the eggs. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social